The brick front of 284 Green Street looks exactly like the one beside it. It looks like the one beside that. The whole road is built this way, a long run of identical two-story terrace houses in post-war engineering brick. The course is level, the mortar lines straight, the proportions determined not by any architectural ambition, but by the practical calculus of public housing construction in the decade after the Second World War. The front gardens are narrow, each one a strip of ground between the pavement edge and the front door, some with low concrete fencing, some with a few feet of grass that catches the late light on summer evenings and holds it briefly before the shadow of the opposite roofline comes across the road and takes it away. On an ordinary evening in the summer of 1977, the street settles into itself the way residential streets do. In the early evening, a car or two parked at the curb, the day's business finished, the particular quietness of a road whose inhabitants have come inside and closed their doors. The house at 284 is mid-terrace. This means it has a neighbor on either side, sharing party walls built from the same brick, the same mortar, the same internal arrangement of rooms reproduced in a dozen variations along the street. The front door opens directly into a narrow hallway. The hallway is the kind of passage that was never intended to be a room in its own right, only a means of getting from the front door to the rooms beyond it, and its proportions reflect that intention faithfully. There is not much room in it. There is room enough to hang a coat, to set down a bag, to move past someone coming the other way, if both people angle their shoulders. Through the hallway, the ground floor holds a sitting room and a kitchen, both modest in their dimensions, both furnished in the practical and worn manner of a home that is used for living rather than for display. The kitchen faces the back of the house. The sitting room faces the street. Upstairs, the layout is similarly compact. The staircase rises from the hallway to a short landing, and off that landing are the bedrooms, the arrangement typical of the house type, with the master bedroom at the front of the property and a second bedroom at the back or side, the bathroom and toilet, small and serviceable in the way that council-built bathrooms of that period were small and serviceable. The room shared by the two eldest Hodgson daughters was fitted with two single beds placed against opposite walls, which left between them a narrow strip of floor covered in worn carpet. The ceiling was close. The window looked out onto Green Street. The same brick fronts, the same parked cars, the same strip of light across the road on summer evenings before the shadow came. The house belonged to the London borough of Enfield. It had belonged to the borough since it was built. Like every other house in that terrace, and most of the houses on that street, and many of the houses in that district, the borough held it in the manner of a local authority holding a large estate of similar properties across a large administrative area. The ownership recorded in files, the tenancy managed through a housing department whose workload was, in 1977, as in most other years, considerably greater than its capacity. Peggy Hodgson was the tenant of record. She paid rent. She had no equity in the property. The house was not hers in any sense beyond the tenancy agreement, and the tenancy agreement was the thing that connected her to it. That specific address, that specific street, that specific room with two beds and a strip of carpet between them. Peggy Hodgson was born Margaret Harper. By the summer of 1977, she was raising 4 children at 284 Green Street without a husband in the house, following the departure of Terry Hodgson, and the household income ran on state benefits and the particular financial arithmetic of a single parent in a northern London district in the middle of the 1970s. This was not an unusual situation. The estates and terraces of Brimsdown held other households arranged similarly. women managing on incomes that did not accommodate much in the way of margin, keeping houses clean and children fed, moving through the routines of daily domestic life in spaces that were not generous in their dimensions or their appointments, but were livable, and lived in and were theirs in the practical daily sense, even if not in the legal one. The Hodgson house on Green Street was that kind of house. The furnishings were worn but functional. The kitchen served its purpose. The rooms held the 4 children and their mother and the ordinary accumulation of objects that any household generates: toys, clothing, school books, the particular low-grade clutter of a family of 5. The 4 children were Margaret, aged approximately 13, in the late summer of 1977, Janet, aged 11, Pete, aged 10, and Billy, the youngest, aged approximately 7. The age range spans from early adolescence down to what is sometimes called middle childhood, old enough in the oldest case to be approaching the particular complicated threshold of teenage life, young enough in the youngest case to still be firmly in the world of a child for whom the house and the street and the small radius of familiar things constitute most of what is known. Janet and Margaret shared the upstairs bedroom with the 2 single beds. Pete and Billy had their own arrangements elsewhere in the house. In the daytime, the children filled the house in the way children fill small houses, noisily, in movement, with the particular kind of domestic presence that makes a house feel inhabited down to its corners. In the evenings, as summer progressed toward August, the house would have settled as the evening outside settled, the street quietening, the light going, the routines of bedtime beginning to draw the younger children upward toward the landing and the rooms above. Brimsdown in 1977 was the kind of district that residents of other parts of London passed through on the train without particularly noticing. It sits in the southeastern part of what had become the London borough of Enfield in the local government reorganization of 1965, a district shaped by the particular combination of post-war council housing and light industry that characterized a number of the Lea Valley corridor settlements running north from the river into Hertfordshire. The Lea Valley, at that point in its geography, was primarily industrial, manufacturing, distribution, the unglamorous infrastructure of a working city, and the sound of it, the faint industrial register that sat at the low edge of hearing in the residential streets nearby, was simply part of the district's ambient texture, not intrusive, not alarming, just present, the way the railway line was present, the way the bus routes were present, the way everything that constituted the practical geography of a working-class district in outer North London was present as a kind of low, constant hum underlying the ordinary days. Green Street itself contributed nothing particular to the borough's history before August 1977. It was a residential road in a residential district. It appears on the street maps of the period the way all streets of its kind appear, a line running between 2 other lines, its name printed in small type, the houses along it represented as the identical rectangles they more or less were. There was no reason for anyone outside the borough to have heard of it, and within the borough it was simply one of many similar streets managed by the housing department in the ordinary course of things. The residents went to work, the children went to school, the houses stood in their terrace, facing the houses in the terrace across the road, the mortar holding the brickwork together, and the brickwork holding the plaster, and the plaster holding the paint, and the paint flaking slightly, in the way that paint on council-maintained houses sometimes flaked before the scheduled maintenance cycle came around again. What it meant to live in a council house in 1977, in a district like Brimsdown, in a borough like Enfield, was partly a matter of domestic fact and partly a matter of administrative relationship. The domestic fact was the house itself, the rooms, the heating, the condition of the windows, the age of the kitchen fittings, the wear on the carpet on the stairs. The administrative relationship was the one between the tenant and the authority, the rent payments, the maintenance requests, the rules of the tenancy, and the structural fact that the tenant held the property at the authority's discretion within the terms the authority had set for as long as the authority allowed. The authority in this case was the London Borough of Enfield. It held a large stock of housing across the district. The demand for that housing in 1977, as in most years of that period, substantially exceeded the supply. A tenant in one property who wished to move to another faced a waiting process whose length was measured not in weeks, but in the longer administrative rhythms of a housing department managing limited stock across a large number of competing applications. This was the background. It did not make the Hodgson situation unusual. It made it ordinary, the ordinary administrative circumstance of a council tenant in a northern London borough at a particular point in the 1970s, holding a tenancy at a specific address because that was where the housing department had placed them, and staying at that address because the mechanisms for moving elsewhere were slow in the way that local authority mechanisms were slow. Peggy Hodgson had 4 children and a tenancy at 284 Green Street. The house was not hers to sell or to leave without the process the borough required. This is a structural fact about the property. It has nothing dramatic in it. It is simply the administrative shape of the household's relationship to the building they inhabited. The bedroom shared by Janet and Margaret looked out onto the street. In the daytime, the window would have admitted ordinary residential light, the diffuse gray-white illumination of a North London summer, adequate for reading if the reader sat close enough to see the room clearly without requiring artificial light until the evening came on. The room's furnishings were modest: 2 single beds along opposite walls, a chest of drawers against one wall, a standard piece of domestic wooden furniture of the kind that appeared in bedrooms of that type throughout the district, throughout the borough, throughout the country. It was heavy. It held the ordinary contents of 2 children's lives. It was unremarkable in the way that all domestic wooden furniture is unremarkable when it is doing what it is supposed to do, which is to stand in one place and hold things. The chest of drawers did not move, not then, not in the summer before late August. It stood where it had been placed, against the wall, and the contents of 2 children's lives remained in their drawers, and the room was what it was: a children's bedroom in a mid-terrace council house in Brimsdown, on a quiet residential street, in an outer London district whose character had been shaped by post-war construction and the long, low industrial reach of the Lea Valley corridor. In late August 1977, all of that was still simply what it was. There was no reason to look at the chest of drawers and see anything other than a chest of drawers. There was no reason to look at the room and see anything other than a room. Green Street ran from one end to the other as it always had. The brick faces of the houses identical, the parked cars at the curb, the particular evening light of a summer in North London coming across the roof lines and going. Billy Hodgson was the youngest of the 4. He was approximately 7 years old in the late summer of 1977, and like most 7-year-olds in residential houses in working-class outer London districts, his world was constituted primarily of the immediate and the familiar. The house on Green Street was the house he lived in. The street outside was the street outside. His older siblings moved through the rooms of the house with the assurance of children who had been there longer and knew its corners and its sounds in the way that children know the places they spend most of their time. Billy was the youngest by several years, the smallest of the four, the one for whom the upstairs rooms and the older children's domestic arrangements were still, in some residual sense, a world slightly larger than his own. He appears in the domestic picture of August 1977, the way youngest children appear in such pictures, present, known, going about the small business of a summer evening in a house on a quiet street, the particular stillness of a residential neighborhood settling around the house as the day finished and the evening came on. The street was not silent in any absolute sense. Streets of that kind never are. There would have been the sound of other houses, a television through a party wall, a car engine somewhere on the road, the far edge of the Lehigh Valley industrial sound that sat beneath everything in that district, like a low, constant tide. There would have been the ordinary evening sounds of a family of five in a mid-terrace house, the kitchen, the children, the particular acoustic texture of a house that is full of people and not very large. These were not remarkable sounds. They were the sounds of a household in operation, the ambient material of daily domestic life in a specific house on a specific street on an ordinary evening in August. The post-war council house as a form had been built in considerable numbers across the outer London boroughs in the late 1940s and through the 1950s, responding to the housing need created by wartime damage and the broader post-war population pressures of a rapidly expanding city. The houses were built to a standard that prioritized function and economy. They were durable, they were meant to last, and they did. The brick was good brick. The construction was sound. The houses on Green Street in 1977 had been standing for roughly 30 years and would stand for 30 more, and beyond that, the same brick courses, the same mortar lines, the same proportions determined by the practical calculations of post-war public housing design. And a house of that type, at that age, in that district, held in a council estate, managed by a local authority housing department, was not a remarkable thing to inhabit. It was a place to live. It served that purpose. The rooms were small, and the ceilings were close, and the carpet on the stairs was worn, but the house was solid and warm enough, and the structure of it held the family inside it without difficulty or drama. There is something worth attending to in the specific spatial arrangement of the girl's bedroom. The two beds against the walls, with the narrow strip of carpet between them, describe a room that is genuinely small, not cramped in any emergency sense, but compact in the particular way that post-war council-built rooms were compact, their dimensions calculated to meet minimum residential standards, rather than to provide comfort beyond the functional. Two children sleeping in that room would have had between their beds a distance roughly equivalent to an outstretched arm. They would have been close enough to hear each other breathing in the night, close enough that the sounds one made would easily reach the other, close enough that the contents of the room, the furniture, the chest of drawers against the wall, the window facing the street, would be visible to both of them from their beds without either of them needing to move. The ceiling was close overhead. This is a detail that does not carry any weight in isolation, but accumulates weight in context. A small room, low ceiling, two beds, a piece of furniture against the wall, a window giving onto a residential street. The room was precisely what it was. It was a children's bedroom. It had been a children's bedroom before the Hodgsons were placed there, and would be a children's bedroom again after them. The same dimensions, the same low ceiling, the same window facing the same street. The furniture would change. The carpet would be replaced in the ordinary cycle of maintenance. The walls would be repainted. The structural facts of the room, its size, its proportions, the window, the close ceiling, the strip of floor between the two possible beds, would remain as they were because they were built into the house, and the house was solid and would stand. The London Borough of Enfield was in 1977 responsible for the administration of a large area of North London that had been consolidated in its current form in 1965 from the earlier municipal boroughs of Edmonton, Enfield, and Southgate. Its housing stock was substantial. Its housing department managed the stock with the kind of administrative deliberateness that large public bodies charged with the distribution of limited essential resources tend to develop. Processes for applications, processes for allocations, processes for transfers, processes for the resolution of disputes, all of them calibrated to a workload that was chronic and large and did not move quickly through its own procedures. A tenancy at a specific address, once assigned and occupied, was not easily transferred. The mechanisms existed, but they were slow. This was not a policy of deliberate obstruction. It was the natural result of large numbers of competing needs being managed by a body with limited resources and substantial obligations. It was the administrative texture of council housing in a large outer London borough in the 1970s, and it was the context in which Peggy Hodgson held the tenancy at 284 Green Street. Green Street, on an ordinary weekday in August 1977, would have looked very much as it had looked the previous August and the August before that. The brick faces of the houses faced each other across the road. The small front gardens held whatever the particular households had chosen to do with them: a square of paving, a strip of grass, a few feet of nothing in particular. The pavement ran along both sides of the road with the consistency of pavements built to a public standard in a residential district, serviceable, undecorated, worn in the places where feet had worn it for 30 years. The road itself carried the ordinary traffic of a residential street: delivery vehicles, residents coming and going, the occasional through driver who had found the residential route a marginally faster way between 2 points on the primary road network. None of this was distinguished. All of it was entirely ordinary. The Hodgson family had been at 284 Green Street for some years before August 1977. The house was familiar to them in the complete and unreflective way that homes become familiar when one has lived in them long enough that they cease to be objects of attention and simply become the ground of daily life. Peggy Hodgson knew the kitchen in the way that one knows a kitchen one has worked in for years, the particular positions of things, the sounds of the appliances, the way the light came through the window at different times of day, the small adjustments required to make the space function for a household of 5. The children knew the house in the way children know the place they live. They knew the sounds of the structure, the way it settled at night, the acoustic difference between sound coming from within the house and sound coming from the street. They knew the feel of the stairs in the dark, the position of the furniture in their rooms. They knew the house the way none of them would ever know it again after late August, because after late August, the house would be known differently. Peggy Hodgson, raising 4 children without a partner in a council house in Brimsdown on state benefits in 1977, was managing a household that was modest by the standards of the borough and not particularly unusual by the standards of the district. Other women in other houses along similar streets in similar parts of outer North London were managing comparable households in comparable circumstances. The post-war welfare state had built the infrastructure, the housing, the benefit system, the schools within which these arrangements were livable. The infrastructure was not generous. It was not designed for comfort beyond the functional. It was designed to provide the minimum conditions necessary for a household to subsist and a family to remain together. It served that purpose. 284 Green Street served that purpose. It held the Hodgson family in its rooms and its staircase and its narrow hallway, and the hallway let them in and out to the street, and the street connected them to the district, and the district sat in its place in the borough, and the borough managed its tenancies at the pace the borough managed its tenancies. The chest of drawers in the girl's bedroom is, in the account of the case that would eventually follow these ordinary summer days, a significant object. In late August 1977, it was not significant. It was a chest of drawers in a children's bedroom in a mid-terrace council house. It held the ordinary contents of 2 children's lives. It stood against the wall in the specific position where it had been placed, heavy in the particular way that solid wooden domestic furniture of that period was heavy. Not ornamental weight, not decorative solidity, but the dense and practical weight of a thing built to last and used to hold. The strip of carpet between the 2 beds ran past it. The low ceiling was above it. The window that looked onto Green Street was to one side of it. The room around it was quiet in the evenings, as the summer evenings settled over the street outside, and the residential sounds of the district moved through their ordinary range, and the house held its inhabitants in their rooms. The borough owned 284 Green Street. It owned it as it owned the adjacent numbers, the houses across the road, the houses on the connecting streets, the estate to the east and the terrace to the west. The demand for housing in the borough had been, for most of the post-war period, substantially greater than the stock the borough held. Families waited for allocations. Families stayed in properties they had been placed in because the mechanisms for moving elsewhere were slow and the alternatives were limited. A tenancy held at a specific address in a specific district of a specific borough was a particular thing, not ownership, not equity, not the kind of attachment to a property that allows one to sell it or leave it and come back to something comparable at one step removed. It was an administrative relationship with a large public body that moved at the pace of large public bodies. Peggy Hodgson held that relationship. It was unremarkable. It was the condition of many thousands of households across the borough's administrative area, and it was the condition of the Hodgson household at 284 Green Street, in a quiet residential road in Brimsdown, in the summer of 1977, before anything had changed. The last evenings of August were ordinary evenings. The light over Green Street was the particular low gold that comes across North London in the late summer, when the angle of the sun has begun to decline from its midsummer height, and the shadows extend further before the day ends. The brick faces of the terraced houses caught that light and held it briefly, the mortar lines between the courses throwing fine shadows, the small front gardens in half light, the road quiet. Inside the house at 284, the end-of-day routines of a family of 5 would have moved through their predictable sequence: the meal, the clearing away, the children moving toward the evening, and eventually toward bed, the younger ones first, the older ones following in the ordinary gradation by which children's bedtimes in a family of 4 are sequenced across an age gap of 6 years. The house was what it was. The street was what it was. The borough owned the house and managed the tenancy through its department and its processes, and the waiting list for council housing in the borough was long, and Peggy Hodgson was the tenant of record at 284 Green Street, and the evening outside settled over the residential road in Brimsdown in the way that evenings settled, and the chest of drawers stood against the wall in the upstairs room. The room was small, the ceiling was close overhead, and the 2 beds were arranged against opposite walls with a narrow strip of carpet running between them, a gap just wide enough to stand in, no wider. It was late August in Brimsdown, and the window of the upstairs bedroom at 284 Green Street let in the particular pale dark of a North London summer night, neither fully black nor lit, the residential street below settled and still. The chest of drawers stood against the wall at the foot of one of the beds, an ordinary piece of domestic wooden furniture, its surface holding the accumulated small things of two children's lives, a glass, a hairbrush, whatever else finds its way onto a surface in a shared bedroom. Nothing about it was notable. Nothing about the room was notable. The house was quiet, and the street outside was quiet, and the night of August 26th, 1977, had not yet become anything other than an ordinary late summer evening in a council house in North London. Peggy Hodgson had been in the house long enough that its sounds were familiar to her, the particular acoustic of old post-war brickwork and thin interior walls, the way sound carried through a small two-story terrace, the small movements and adjustments of a household of five settling toward sleep. What she heard first, from the room shared by Janet and Margaret, was knocking, not a single knock, persistent knocking, the kind that repeated with enough regularity that it did not suggest anything accidental, not a pipe, not the settling of a wall, not something blown against a surface by the movement of air through a window left ajar. What she reported hearing was a rhythmic, sustained sound, coming from within the room rather than from outside it, and it brought her to the doorway before she fully understood what she was moving toward. Janet was 11 years old. Margaret was approximately 13. Pete, who was 10, was nearby, in or close enough to the room to be aware of what was happening, close enough that his presence and proximity were noted in the accounts Peggy gave later. The children's descriptions of what they experienced that night have been recorded and preserved across multiple accounts, and what Janet and Pete reported to their mother in the immediate aftermath was consistent. They had heard the knocking before anything else, and they had been close to the chest of drawers when it moved. Peggy described their responses as genuine fear rather than excitement, a distinction she made and held to when she recounted what happened. The knocking had come first. The movement of the chest of drawers had come after. The chest of drawers was not a light piece of furniture. It was a standard domestic item of solid wooden construction, the kind of mass-produced household furniture common to council properties of that period, heavy enough under ordinary circumstances to require meaningful physical effort to shift across a carpeted floor. What Peggy Hodgson reported was that she witnessed the piece move, shift position across the bedroom floor, without any visible human agency behind it. She stated she saw it move. She then reported that she attempted to push it back toward the wall herself and found that she could not easily do so. That detail, the effort required to move the chest by hand, the difficulty she encountered when she tried, became one of the most consistently noted specifics in the earliest accounts of the case, not because it settled anything, but because it was the kind of concrete physical observation that sat at the center of what the family reported and could not readily set aside. The question of what Peggy Hodgson saw in that room on that night is not a question that has been answered. What she reported is documented. What she witnessed, what actually occurred on the floor of the upstairs bedroom at 284 Green Street in the late evening of August 26, 1977, is not something the available record can confirm or close. The documentation of the case begins with her account, and her account begins with the knocking and the chest of drawers and the children standing in the room. And it was this sequence of reported events, unremarkable in their domestic specificity, extraordinary in what she claimed they contained, that led to the decision she made shortly afterward to pick up the telephone. Calling the police to report that furniture had moved in a child's bedroom was an unusual thing to do. It was also the decision that gave the events of that night a form of external documentation they would not otherwise have possessed. The decision that introduced the first credentialed witness whose observations were preserved in a written record maintained outside the family's own accounts. Peggy Hodgson made that call. The exact content of what she said to the officer on the other end of the line is not part of what has been preserved, but what came through the front door of 284 Green Street in response to it was a uniformed woman police constable, notebook in hand, arriving on what would have presented itself as an unusual domestic call, but a domestic call nonetheless, a family in a council house in Brimsdown reporting a disturbance, the kind of call that could have been, and often would have been, resolved within minutes and never mentioned again. The specific officer who attended was woman police constable Carolyn Heaps. Her name is part of the documented record of the case. Her rank, her attendance, and the contents of the statement she subsequently filed have been preserved and have been referenced in investigative accounts produced in the years since. She arrived at 284 Green Street as a professional presence, uniformed, trained, in possession of the observational habits and the institutional expectations that police officers carry with them into any situation, and she stood in the downstairs sitting room of the house with the Hodgson family, in a ground floor room with ordinary furniture, on an ordinary residential street, in a borough of North London that had no particular reason to be remarkable. The sitting room at 284 Green Street was a modest space, as council sitting rooms of that period were modest. The proportions of a post-war terrace, the furnishings of a household running on state benefits, functional and worn, nothing that would draw the attention in any other context. There was a large armchair. It was positioned somewhere in the room, as armchairs in sitting rooms are positioned, against a wall, or near the center, or at an angle toward the television set that would have been present in most living rooms in 1977. The precise position of the armchair before the event is not something the record preserves with enough specificity to reconstruct exactly. What the record does preserve is what WPC Heaps reported happening to it. According to the statement she filed, WPC Carolyn Heaps witnessed the large armchair move across the sitting room floor of its own accord. The displacement she documented was approximately 4 feet. She stated in her written account that she was present in the room, that she observed the movement, and that she could not explain it by any means available to her as an observer. The statement does not speculate about what caused the movement. It does not propose a mechanism. It records what a uniformed officer reported seeing, in plain language, in the form of an official document filed with the police service following her attendance at 284 Green Street on the night of August 26, 1977. 4 feet? That is not a small displacement. A large armchair moving 4 feet across a carpeted floor in a council sitting room, in the presence of a police officer who was attending an official call, is not a detail that resolves easily into any ordinary framework for what happens in domestic spaces. Deputy Heaps was not an investigator of paranormal phenomena. She was not a member of any research organization. She was not in the house because she was looking for something strange. She was there because a resident of the borough had called the police, and she attended the call, and while she was in the room, the armchair moved, and she filed a statement recording that fact. The statement is part of the documentary record of the Enfield case. It has been cited in investigative accounts produced in the years following, and it has been held up by those who take the case's reported events seriously as precisely the kind of external corroboration that distinguishes a credible report from a purely domestic claim. An official document prepared by a professional witness describing a specific physical event in a specific location at a specific time. What the statement does not do, what no statement can do, is establish why the armchair moved. Deputy Heaps documented that it did. She documented that she witnessed it. She documented that she could not account for it. Those three things are the entirety of what her written record contributes, and they are, taken together, a particular kind of fact, the documented observation of a specific anomalous event by a specific named witness whose professional position gave her account a form of institutional weight. The house was quiet after the armchair stopped moving. That is the nature of these things. The event occurred, the displacement happened, and then the room was simply itself again, the furniture in its new position, the armchair 4 feet from where it had been, the sitting room at 284 Green Street in the late evening of August 26, 1977. File PC Heaps present, the Hodgson family present, the particular stillness that follows something that has not yet been explained, settling around all of them in a ground floor room in a North London council house. What happens in the immediate aftermath of an anomalous event, the interval between the event and the moment when it is formally recorded, is where most of the interpretive difficulty in the Enfield case begins to accumulate, but that difficulty belongs to later in the story. On the night itself, what followed the armchair's movement was a written statement. WPC Heaps prepared a document. She set down in that document what she had observed. She submitted it. The event became official, in the modest and specific sense that it was now part of a record maintained outside the family's own accounts, attested by a witness whose professional obligations required her to describe accurately what she had seen and not embellish or omit. The knocking that had begun the night did not end with Heaps's attendance. Accounts of what occurred in the days and nights immediately following August 26th describe a pattern of disturbance that established itself across the upstairs bedroom and the downstairs sitting room with enough consistency and enough witnesses, family members, neighbors, eventually journalists and investigators, that the events at 284 Green Street began, within weeks, to become something the borough knew about. Word moved through the street. It moved through the borough. The pattern of reported disturbances, its first night documented in WPC Heaps's statement, and in the accounts Peggy Hodgson gave to multiple people in the days that followed, began to develop its own weight in the local awareness of Brimsdown, and before long, the wider awareness of North London. But the chest of drawers in the upstairs bedroom remains. In any attempt to understand the case, the beginning, it is where the sequence starts. 2 children in a small shared room, a narrow carpet between 2 single beds, a heavy piece of wooden furniture against the wall, and then something that Peggy Hodgson reported, and her children reported, and that she could not move back toward the wall herself when she tried. The room was ordinary. The furniture was ordinary. The house was an ordinary mid-terrace council property in Brimsdown, with a narrow hallway and a ground floor sitting room and a kitchen and 2 stories and a street outside that looked like every other street in the borough. The ordinariness of the setting is part of what makes the reported events so persistent in the record, not despite the domestic simplicity of the scene, but because of it. The chest of drawers was not in an ancient building. It was not in a remote location. It was against a wall in an upstairs bedroom in a council house on a residential road in North London, and what Peggy Hodgson reported it doing has been in the case file ever since. The interval between the initial disturbances and the arrival of Carolyn Heaps that night was probably brief. A household in the state Peggy Hodgson described. Children frightened, furniture reported to have moved, the house producing sounds without apparent source. Was not a household in which long deliberation was likely before the decision to call for external assistance. The telephone call placed the events outside the family's private experience for the first time. It created the expectation of a witness, and the witness, when she arrived and stood in the sitting room of 284 Green Street, produced the written record that has been consulted and cited and debated in every account of the Enfield case produced since. The record of that night is not complete. No record of any single night is complete. What has been preserved? Peggy Hodgson's account of the chest of drawers and the knocking, the children's reported fear, the difficulty Peggy encountered when she tried to move the chest back herself, and WPC Heaps's statement documenting the armchair's displacement of 4 feet across the floor of the downstairs sitting room is a specific and particular body of evidence generated on a specific night in a specific house by people who were present and who recorded what they reported having seen. None of those reports have been retracted. Peggy Hodgson held to her account of what she witnessed in the upstairs bedroom for the rest of her time in the case. WPC Heaps's statement remained part of the documentary record. The children's accounts, gathered in the days and weeks following, were consistent on the core detail of the knocking and the furniture. What the record establishes is that something was reported, something specific with specific witnesses, on a specific night, and that the first external witness to attend 284 Green Street returned from it with a document in which she stated that she had seen an armchair move across a sitting room floor and that she could not account for it. That document exists. It is part of the case file maintained in the archive of the Society for Psychical Research, where the materials relating to 284 Green Street have been held since the early years of the investigation. The statement is there, the date, the address, the officer's name, the specific observation, the phrase she could not explain. It sits in the file alongside everything else that was accumulated in the months and years following that August night, the whole weight of the documented case resting, in its earliest layer, on the events of those first hours: a chest of drawers in a children's bedroom, the sound of knocking in a quiet house, and a police officer standing in a ground floor sitting room, watching an armchair move 4 feet across the floor. The street outside was still. The late summer night had not moved on to anything else yet. It was still August 26th, still Brimsdown, still a residential road in the London borough of Enfield, the brick fronts of the terraces unchanged. The particular mild dark of a North London summer night, resting across the houses and the gardens and the narrow pavements. What was happening inside 284 Green Street had not yet found the shape it would take across the following months. The knocking was the beginning. The chest of drawers was the beginning. WPC Heaps, standing in the sitting room, watching the armchair cross the floor, and returning afterward to her station to write down what she had seen. That was the beginning of the record. Everything that came after, built on that foundation, a family's report, an officer's statement, and the specific unresolved fact of a displacement that could not be accounted for in a council house on Green Street on an otherwise ordinary night in late August. The weeks that followed brought more of what the first night had established. The knocking returned. It was heard not only by the Hodgson family, but by neighbors whose proximity to the semi-detached and terraced housing of the street placed them close enough to the source to register it without being in the house. Peggy Hodgson continued to gather the observations of her children. The pattern that was beginning to form, sounds first, then physical displacement, then witnesses from outside the family encountering the same phenomena independently, was not yet understood as a pattern. It was simply what was happening. The house continued to produce what its occupants reported it producing, and the first layer of documentation continued to accumulate in the police record and in Peggy's own account, and in the spoken testimony of neighbors who had heard what they heard through the walls of adjacent properties. The chest of drawers remained in the girl's bedroom. It had been moved, if the accounts are taken at face value, by something other than a person, and then found to resist easy repositioning when Peggy attempted to move it manually. It remained where it had ended up, a piece of ordinary domestic furniture occupying its new position in a small upstairs room until the physical arrangements of the investigation that would follow in subsequent weeks required other accommodations. It is, in the context of the case, the first physical object. The armchair in the sitting room is the second. Both are pieces of furniture, heavy, wooden, unremarkable domestic objects of the kind found in council properties across the borough, and both are, in the documented record of 284 Green Street, associated with movements that the witnesses who reported them stated they could not explain. What it means for a piece of furniture to move in the specific sense the case requires, not pushed by a person, not knocked by an accident of physics, not the result of any process an observer in the room could identify, is a question the record holds rather than answers. The record is very specific about what was reported. It is not specific, and cannot be specific, about what caused the movement. That distinction is where the Enfield case lives, in its earliest days and throughout everything that followed. The observations are documented, the causes are not. The sitting room at 284 Green Street on the night of August 26, 1977, after the armchair had come to rest in its new position, was a room in which something had happened that had not yet been explained. The furniture was displaced, the witness was present, the statement would be written. Outside, the street was quiet, as it had been all evening, as it would be through the rest of the night. The houses along Green Street settled, and still in the late summer dark, the borough continuing around them, the world going on in its ordinary way, while inside one particular two-story council house, something had begun that would not be settled for a very long time. Wong P.C. Heaps left 284 Green Street that night and returned to her professional life. The statement she filed traveled through the appropriate channels and eventually came to rest in the documentary record, where it has remained. She had attended a domestic call. She had observed something she could not account for. She had done the thing her training and her professional obligations required her to do. She had documented it, precisely, with the date and the address and the specific detail of what she saw, and the honest declaration that she could not explain it. And then she had returned to the borough and the night and the ordinary world outside the house on Green Street. The armchair remained where it had come to rest. The upstairs bedroom remained as it was. The two beds, the narrow carpet, the chest of drawers in its new position. The knocking that had begun the night did not resolve itself into a source, did not explain itself, did not give the family anything beyond its own persistence to hold on to. The house was a council house in Brimsdown. The street was a residential road in the London borough of Enfield. The night was late August 1977, and whatever had moved the armchair 4 feet across the sitting room floor had left behind it only the displaced furniture and WPC Carolyn Heaps's written statement, and the particular quiet that follows a thing that cannot yet be explained, all of it sitting together in the documentary record, waiting to be read. The statement is still there. The address on it is still 284 Green Street. The date is still August 26, 1977. The officer's name is still Carolyn Heaps. What she wrote, that she witnessed the armchair move, that she could not account for the movement, that she had been present in the room and had no explanation for what she had observed, has not changed. The document holds the same words it held when she produced it, and the question it contains, the honest, specific, professionally attested question of what moved the armchair across the sitting room floor of a council house in North London on a quiet late summer evening, is a question that the statement does not answer, has never answered, and in all the years since it was written down, has not been satisfactorily answered by anyone else. Janet Hodgson had an ordinary voice, an 11-year-old girl's voice, thin and light, with the particular quality of a child who has grown up in a council house in North London, the vowels of Brimsdown, the cadence of a household of 5, the sound of someone not quite yet a teenager speaking to adults in a room that still felt too full of them. That voice was documented, noted, unremarkable. And then there was the other one. The other voice arrived in the autumn of 1977, in the weeks following the initial disturbances at 284 Green Street, and it arrived from the same throat, lower, rougher, a register that belonged, acoustically, to a man well into middle age, a deep, worn, grinding quality, the kind of vocal texture produced by decades of living rather than 11 years of it. Investigators Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair were present on a number of the occasions when the voice was heard, and they documented those occasions with the same methodical attention they brought to the physical phenomena, dates recorded, times noted, witnesses named, the voice's words written down, and in time preserved on tape, what the voice said and what it claimed to be, and what independent researchers subsequently found when they followed those claims into the public record, became one of the most examined and most debated elements of the entire Enfield case. The voice did not arrive quietly or gradually. Witnesses in the room described it appearing with the abruptness of a switch. Janet present, Janet's ordinary voice present, and then the other voice occupying the same space, speaking from the same child in a register so markedly different that the contrast itself became a fact in the record. Gross noted this contrast explicitly. Playfair noted it. Neighbors and journalists who passed through 284 Green Street during the investigation and were present when the voice emerged noted it. The acoustic distance between Janet's normal speech and what was recorded on those autumn evenings was not subtle. It was the kind of difference that the ear catches immediately, and that the mind then works to account for, without arriving anywhere comfortable. The question of how the voice was produced, mechanically, physiologically, was one that Gross and Playfair pursued with clinical seriousness, rather than leaving it as an open atmospheric fact. A laryngologist was brought in to examine Janet. His name appears in the case documentation as Dr. John Froggatt, and what he found was specific enough to be recorded and cited, though it answered one question while leaving another entirely open. The examination identified that the gruff voice was being produced through false vocal fold phonation, a mechanism that uses the upper ventricular folds of the larynx, rather than the lower folds that produce normal modal speech. False vocal fold phonation generates a sound that is characteristically lower, rougher, and more resonant than the voice a person ordinarily uses. It accounts in purely anatomical terms for why the sound coming from Janet's throat was so markedly different from her speaking voice. The mechanics of the thing were identified. They were named. They were filed in the case record as a clinical finding. What the examination could not address, and what Dr. Froggatt's findings, whatever their explanatory value for the acoustic properties of the voice, left entirely untouched, was the content of what the voice said. The physical mechanism described how a human larynx could produce a sound of that register and texture. It described nothing about why the voice spoke, what it said across dozens of recorded sessions, the biographical details it offered and maintained, or the question of whether a child under sustained observation in a council house in Brimsdown was capable of producing, without preparation or coaching, a consistent first-person narrative in a voice her own body should not have been able to generate. The laryngological finding sat in the case file as a medical record. The voice sat in the tape archive as a sound. The two facts did not by themselves resolve each other. False vocal fold phonation as a technique is not unknown to researchers in voice and phonation, and it is not impossible for a child or adult to learn to produce it. Certain styles of singing in particular traditions make deliberate use of the ventricular folds. There are documented cases of individuals developing the technique. The examination did not suggest that Janet had pathological changes to her larynx, or that the voice was being produced by a mechanism outside her voluntary control. What it established was the anatomical explanation for the acoustic quality of the sound, the how of the roughness, the how of the depth, the question of what moved the voice, what populated it, what gave it its content and its consistency across sessions recorded weeks apart, was not a question Dr. Froggatt's instruments could answer. That question remained in the case in the same condition it had always been in, open, documented, and unresolved. The voice in those recorded sessions spoke. It did not merely vocalize or produce sound, it held conversations. Gross and Playfair addressed it directly, asked it questions, and received answers of varying coherence and specificity across the sessions they recorded. The voice was not always cooperative, it was sometimes dismissive. On some occasions it was difficult to understand, the gruff register compounding the challenge of transcription, the tape capturing sounds that required careful replay before their content could be written down. On other occasions, it spoke with a clarity that left no ambiguity about what it was saying. What it said, consistently and across multiple sessions with multiple witnesses present, was this: its name was Bill. It had lived at 284 Green Street. It had died there, in the downstairs sitting room, in a chair. The cause of its death, as it described it, was a hemorrhage. It gave a surname, Wilkins. It named a son, Robert. The biographical specificity of the voice's claims was not lost on the investigators. A child producing a rough, low voice and attributing that voice to a presence in the house was one kind of event. A child producing a rough, low voice and offering, across multiple sessions, a consistent first-person account with a name, a surname, a cause of death, a relationship, and a location within the house. That was something the investigators felt they could follow into the historical record. Gross, whose methodical instincts were well documented by those who worked alongside him, understood that the value of verifiable biographical claims was precisely their verifiability. Either the record would support them, or it would not. The voice had named itself. The investigation could check. Robert Wilkins was found. He was contacted by researchers following the investigation's pursuit of the biographical claims made during the recorded sessions, and what he told them was documented in the case materials. His father's name had been Bill Wilkins. Bill Wilkins had lived at 284 Green Street. He had died in the house. The specific detail of the downstairs sitting room, the chair, the hemorrhage, these were matched against what Robert Wilkins confirmed to the investigators about his father's death. The correspondence was noted, recorded, and preserved in the case file. It was not treated by Gross and Playfair as conclusive proof of anything beyond the correspondence itself, though the implications they drew from it were clear enough in Playfair's 1980 account of the investigation. What the record established was specific and narrow. The voice had named details that matched a historical person, and that person's surviving son had confirmed those details. What the record did not establish, and what no documentation in the case could establish, was why the voice knew them or how. The question of what it means for biographical claims made in a recorded session to correspond to the historical record is one that sits at the center of the Enfield case's most contested ground. There are researchers who hold that the correspondence between the voice's account and Robert Wilkins's confirmation is the single most difficult element of the case to account for through ordinary means. A child improvising a fictional dead resident might choose any name, any cause of death, any domestic detail. The probability that improvisation would land on the correct surname, the correct forename, the correct manner of death, and the correct location within the house, the downstairs sitting room, the chair, is not zero, but it is not high, and the convergence of those specific details with what Robert Wilkins independently confirmed has remained one of the points in the record that researchers on both sides have spent the most effort examining. There are also researchers who hold that the biographical correspondence is not impossible to account for by ordinary means, that the Hodgson family, having lived at 284 Green Street for some time before the disturbances, might have encountered information about previous residents through neighbors, through local knowledge, through the informal networks of a settled residential street where people know each other's histories, and that information absorbed in that way, without being consciously retained, could surface in an altered state or under the pressure of sustained performance, without its source being apparent to the person producing it. This hypothesis does not require deliberate deception. It requires only that the voice's knowledge of Bill Wilkins was not paranormal, but prior, absorbed through the ordinary mechanisms of a life lived in a particular house on a particular street in North London. The record does not rule this out. It also does not confirm it. The correspondence remains what it is, a documented fact in the case file, sitting in its folder. The question it raises neither answered nor dismissed. The tapes themselves are worth dwelling on because they represent something specific in the archive of the case, not accounts of the voice, not descriptions of the voice by investigators who heard it, but the voice itself, preserved. Gross and Playfair made extensive recordings during the investigation. They used reel-to-reel equipment, the technology of the period, and the resulting tapes were deposited with the Society for Psychical Research following the conclusion of the active investigation, where they have remained as part of the Enfield case file in the SPR archive. Researchers who have accessed the archive in the decades since have been able to listen to those recordings, not to read about them, not to read transcriptions of them, but to hear the voice as it was captured in those sessions, in the room at 284 Green Street, with the spools turning, and Janet present, and the investigators asking their questions across the narrow space of a council house sitting room in the late 1970s. The acoustic quality of the recordings is specific and recognizable. The background texture of a domestic room in that period, the particular resonance of a small interior space, the quality of microphone and tape that belonged to that decade, surrounds the voice, gives it context, places it in time and in place in a way that a transcript or a description cannot do. The voice on the tape is exactly what the witnesses described: low, rough, worn, a grinding register that sits far below anything Janet's normal speech produces. Listeners who have encountered the recordings without prior knowledge of the case have described the contrast with her ordinary voice, when both appear on the same tape, as striking in a way that description alone does not convey. The tape captures that contrast directly. It fixes it in magnetic oxide on a strip of material that has outlasted the investigation, and the house as it was, and most of the people who were present when it was recorded. The SPR archive received those tapes as part of a broader deposit of case materials. Gross's notes, the incident log, photographs, correspondence, and the Enfield materials as a whole represent one of the more extensively documented alleged poltergeist investigations in the Society's history. The archive is a physical institution in London, the records held in folders and boxes as physical objects, the tapes catalogued and stored in the conditions appropriate to their preservation. Researchers who wish to access the Enfield materials can do so through the Society's archive. The tapes are not hidden. They are not restricted beyond the ordinary protocols of archive access. The voice on them is available to anyone willing to visit the archive and request the relevant material, and a number of researchers, journalists, and documentary producers have done exactly that over the decades since the investigation concluded. The accessibility of the tapes has meant that the Enfield case, unlike many alleged phenomena that rest entirely on the accounts of specific witnesses, has a recorded primary source at its center, something that can be heard, analyzed, and reanalyzed, something that does not age or change its account, something whose physical properties can be examined with whatever acoustic tools are available at the time of examination. The roughness of the voice, its register, the specific phonation mechanism Dr. Froggatt identified. All of these are properties of the sound on the tape that researchers have been able to approach independently of the accounts given by Gross, Playfair, or the Hodgson family. The tape does not depend on memory. It does not require trust in any particular witness. It holds what it holds. What it holds and what it does not are both part of the record. The tape holds the voice. It holds the acoustic quality, the register, the words spoken in those sessions, the biographical claims the voice made about its name and its death and its son. The tape does not hold an explanation. It does not identify its own source. It captures a sound produced in a room in a council house in North London in 1977 by the larynx of an 11-year-old girl, and it preserves that sound, and the fact of that preservation is both the most useful and the most limited thing the archive has to offer anyone who approaches the Enfield case with genuine attention. The voice is there. The question of what the voice was is not answered by listening to it. The question simply becomes more specific, more concrete, more present, the way any question becomes more present when the evidence that generates it is directly in front of you rather than described at a distance. The sessions in which the voice spoke were not all of uniform character. Gross and Playfair documented a range of interactions across the months of the active investigation, and the voice's behavior in those sessions varied in ways that the investigators noted and that appear in the records they kept. There were sessions in which the voice was expansive, willing to answer questions, specific in its claims. There were others in which it was resistant or monosyllabic, or in which it seemed to deflect rather than engage. There were sessions in which it said things that did not correspond to anything verifiable, claims that could not be checked against the historical record, assertions that remained in the air of the room without any means of corroboration. The biographical correspondence with Bill Wilkins was not the only content the voice produced. It was the content that proved verifiable and was subsequently verified. The remainder of what the voice said across those sessions exists in the transcript and on the tape without any external anchor, words spoken in a gruff register by an 11-year-old girl in a council house, preserved in the archive, alongside the words that turned out to match a historical person's life and death. The investigators' response to the voice, as recorded in their own accounts, was shaped by the accumulated weight of their time in the house and their ongoing effort to distinguish between phenomena they considered genuine and moments they recognized as performance or manufacture. Both Gross and Playfair were aware, as the investigation progressed, that not everything occurring at 284 Green Street was beyond ordinary explanation. They documented their own observations of events they had not been able to account for, alongside their observations of events they had watched Janet or her siblings produce. The voice occupied a particular position in their assessment because it was recorded, because it existed on tape rather than solely in memory, because it could be returned to, because its content could be checked. The tape gave it a durability that a visual phenomenon witnessed once and not repeated could not have, and the fact that it could be checked and that checking it had produced, in the case of the Bill Wilkins biography, a correspondence that could not be dismissed without accounting for it, meant the voice remained at the center of the investigators' assessment of the case as a whole, the element they returned to most often when articulating what they believed could not be explained by fraud or misperception alone. The laryngological examination and the tape archive together represent the two most direct forms of physical evidence available in the case. One is a clinical document, a finding about the anatomy of Janet Hodgson's larynx, recorded by a named physician, establishing the mechanism by which the voice was produced. The other is an acoustic record, a set of reels held in an archive, the voice present on the tape in its own unmediated texture, available to researchers in a form that does not pass through anyone else's account or memory or interpretation. Between those two things, the medical finding and the tape, there is a gap that neither can close. The medical finding describes the instrument. The tape records the performance. Neither explains the other. Neither addresses the question of what moved the voice from a child who spoke with the vowels of Brimsdown into the sustained delivery of a first-person biography belonging to a man named Bill, who had died in the downstairs sitting room of the same house decades before, in a chair. That questions, specific, documented, and unresolved, is what the tapes carry. It is what they have always carried. From the evening in 1977, when the spools began turning in a room on Green Street, through the transfer to the SPR archive, through the decades of researchers requesting access and sitting with headphones and listening to the gruff, rough sound of a voice that should not have been in that house. The recordings did not settle the Enfield case. They deepened it in the particular way that primary evidence deepens rather than resolves, by making the strangeness more specific, more detailed, more present, more exactly itself. Janet Hodgson was 11 years old when the voice first emerged from her throat in the autumn of 1977. She is no longer 11. The house at 284 Green Street still stands on its residential road in Brimsdown, the brick unchanged, the street otherwise indistinguishable from the residential streets that surround it. The tapes in the SPR archive are older now, the magnetic oxide carrying the voice through more decades than the investigation occupied, the reels sitting in their storage conditions in the archives building in London. When researchers access the Enfield materials from the SPR collection, they find the tapes in the state they have been in since they were deposited, cataloged, labeled, the case reference marked, the contents as Gross and Playfair recorded them. The voice is on the tape. It does not change between one researcher's visit and the next. It says what it said in the council house in 1977. Bill, Wilkins, the downstairs room, the chair, the hemorrhage, Robert. It says these things in the specific rough, low register of false vocal fold phonation from the larynx of a child, the words preserved in magnetic oxide on a strip of material held in a building in London, the question they carry still sitting open on the archive shelf beside them, neither answered nor put away, the way a question sits that has been carefully looked at and found to be still genuinely difficult. The tape does not answer it. The tape is simply there. The voice on the tape is simply there, and the archive that holds it continues to hold it. The reels stored in the quiet of an institutional building, the recordings available, the voice waiting in the particular stillness of something that has been preserved, low and rough and specific and unresolved, the way it was in that autumn room in 1977, the spools turning, the microphone placed close, the sound of it filling the tape with its weight and its strange particular persistence. Maurice Gross arrived at 284 Green Street on a September morning in 1977, carrying recording equipment and a notebook. He was 58 years old, a British inventor and businessman who had spent much of his working life in product development and marketing, and he stood on the narrow front path of a mid-terrace council house in Brimsdown while the ordinary residential street settled around him. The brick fronts identical in either direction, the small gardens, the particular quiet of a North London neighborhood on a weekday morning. He had come through the Society for Psychical Research. He had asked to be assigned to a case. The previous year had been a difficult one. In 1976, Gross's daughter Janet had been killed in a motorcycle accident, and the weight of that loss had carried him toward a question he had not previously spent much time with, whether something of a person continued after the physical fact of their death. It was not a question he had arrived at intellectually. It was a question he had arrived at as a father, in grief, in the particular way that people sometimes come to the borderland of what is established and find that the open ground beyond it has become personally important. He had joined the Society for Psychical Research shortly after Janet's death. When the call came in about a council house in Brimsdown, where a family was reporting that furniture was moving on its own, he asked to go. The investigators who arrive at a case carry themselves with them. This is neither a criticism of Gross nor a claim about what he found at 284 Green Street. It is simply a fact about how any investigation works, and one that the people who later scrutinized the Enfield case would return to repeatedly. Gross brought a methodical instinct. He brought recording equipment, a structured approach to documentation, and a genuine commitment to keeping accurate notes. He also brought the emotional stake of a man for whom the question of whether consciousness survives death had ceased to be abstract. Both things arrived on that September morning. They never became fully separable. Guy Leon Playfair joined the investigation in the weeks that followed. He was a different kind of person, a journalist and author who had spent time in Brazil in the early 1970s and had investigated alleged poltergeist cases there before returning to Britain, bringing with him a body of field experience in cases of this kind and a temperament formed more by reporting than by personal loss. He had published a book on Brazilian cases before the Enfield investigation began. He arrived at Green Street carrying his own prior conclusions about what poltergeist phenomena were, where they came from, and what a proper account of them should look like. The two men would work together at 284 Green Street, across a period of more than a year. They would eventually disagree, as collaborators often do, but in the autumn of 1977, they were still at the beginning. The Society for Psychical Research, which had sent Gross to the house, had been founded in London in 1882. Its founding purpose was to investigate paranormal phenomena through rigorous and impartial methods, to bring the standards of scientific inquiry to a category of reported experience that science had largely declined to examine. The SPR had, over its history, accumulated a significant body of case documentation, developed internal protocols aimed at distinguishing genuine anomalous events from fraud and misperception, and attracted members ranging from committed believers to committed skeptics, united less by shared conclusions than by a shared conviction that the subject merited serious attention. By 1977, it was nearly a century old. It had seen a great many cases. It had also seen a great many cases fall apart under examination. The institutional framework the SPR provided was not, in practice, a framework of unified belief. It was a framework of organized inquiry that contained, and sometimes struggled to contain, the full spectrum of positions that serious investigators brought to the evidence. Gross was among its more persuaded members. Others were not. The case files that accumulated at the SPR during the Enfield investigation would eventually reflect this, not a single institutional verdict, but the layered record of what different people had seen, argued, noted, and concluded when they looked at the same house and the same family and applied their differing methods. Gross began the incident log early in the investigation. It was a physical document, pages, dates, times, the initials of whoever had been present, and descriptions of what they had reported witnessing. A small object moving across a surface, a sound from a room where no one was standing, a displacement of furniture that two people reported simultaneously and could not, on inspection, account for. The log grew steadily through the autumn and into the winter of 1977. It grew through 1978. By the time the investigation's most intensive phase had passed, it contained the cumulative record of hundreds of hours spent in a two-story council house in North London, hundreds of entries, hundreds of dates, hundreds of witness initials, beside descriptions that ranged from the ambiguous to the specific. The incident log was not Gross's only instrument. He also ran tape recorders during sessions at the house, and these recordings captured what happened in the room as it happened. Voices, ambient sound, the quality of silence before and after reported events. He took photographs. He gathered written statements from people beyond the Hodgson family, from neighbors who had visited the house and reported witnessing events they could not explain, from professionals who had been called to the property for unrelated reasons and had stayed to observe, from journalists and researchers who had heard about the case and come to Green Street to see what was happening for themselves. The investigation, in its documentary ambition, was unusually thorough for a case of this kind. Playfair began taking his own notes alongside Gross's. He brought a journalist's sense of what made a detail worth recording, the specific, the named, the precisely timed, and a journalist's ear for inconsistency and evasion. He watched the children carefully. He watched the family. He watched how the disturbances changed over time, how the phenomena shifted in character as the investigation deepened and as the house filled with more and more outside attention. He was building, even as the investigation proceeded, toward the account he would eventually write. His notebooks were a parallel record to Gross's incident log, arriving at the same material from a slightly different angle, carrying a different set of prior commitments toward what the material meant. The published account that came from Playfair's notebooks arrived in 1980 under the title, "This House is Haunted." It remains, more than 4 decades later, the most detailed documentary record of the Enfield case in print. This is a complicated thing to say about a book that is also an explicit argument for the paranormal interpretation of the events it describes. The book carries its author's conclusions openly. Playfair believed that what happened at 284 Green Street was genuine, that the phenomena were real, that the family had been subject to something that existing frameworks of explanation could not adequately account for. Those conclusions are present in the text from the beginning. A reader coming to the book looking for neutral documentation will have to do some work to separate the reported observations from the interpretive frame they arrive in. The complication is that the documentation inside the argument is genuinely substantial. The dates are specific, the times are recorded, the witnesses are named, the physical descriptions, dimensions of rooms, positions of furniture, the precise movements attributed to objects are particular enough to be checked against other records, and in the cases where they have been checked, they are generally consistent with what others reported independently. The book is both a primary source and a tendentious argument, and those two things coexist throughout it without fully resolving. Researchers on both sides of the debate have used it precisely because the evidentiary content survives the interpretive frame. The SPR's response to the investigation was not, internally, what the public version of the case sometimes implies. The Society did not speak with one voice about Enfield. There were members who found Gross and Playfair's documentation persuasive, and there were members who did not. Among those who were less persuaded was Anita Gregory, a psychologist and SPR member who visited 284 Green Street herself on a number of occasions and who arrived at conclusions significantly different from those of the men who had been living in and out of the house for months. Gregory sat in the rooms of 284 Green Street and watched. She watched Janet and Margaret. She watched the adults around them. She took her own notes and she formed her own judgments, and when she returned to her desk and assembled those judgments into a formal report for the SPR, what she produced was not a document that shared Gross's sense of the case. Her report described specific witnessed instances of the children producing phenomena deliberately, manufacturing sounds, staging displacements, performing for the investigators and visitors who had given the house, and the children in particular, a sustained and serious quality of attention that such children had not previously received. She also criticized the methodology of the investigation itself, arguing that the absence of systematic controls meant the evidentiary record as a whole was built on a foundation too fragile to support the conclusions Gross and Playfair were drawing from it. Gregory's report sat in the SPR archive alongside Gross's notes. The two documents were produced by people who had been inside the same house, watching the same children, attempting to determine what was happening there. They arrived at results that could not both be entirely right. This was not a scandal or a crisis. It was the normal condition of an investigation that had not been designed with the systematic controls that would have allowed a more definitive determination. It was in some ways the expected outcome of an investigation conducted in the specific uncontrolled circumstances of a family home on a residential street in North London, where the phenomena arrived when they arrived, and the investigators worked with whatever access they had at the time. The specific occasions where Gross and Playfair themselves acknowledged observed fabrication are worth attending to carefully, because they are part of the investigative record in a way that is sometimes misrepresented on both sides of the debate. Both investigators noted, in their own documentation, specific moments where Janet appeared to be producing phenomena rather than experiencing them, throwing objects she had previously claimed had flown spontaneously, attempting to bend metal items when she believed she was unobserved. These were not revelations forced on them by outside critics. They were observations the investigators themselves made and recorded in their own notes. They are in the same files as the accounts of incidents that Gross and Playfair assessed as genuine. Gross's response to these observations was to place them in a particular interpretive frame. What he wrote, in substance, was that a chronically stressed 11-year-old who had been living at the center of an extraordinary, frightening, and widely publicized situation for an extended period, could reasonably be expected to perform when genuine events failed to occur, that the deceptions, where they occurred, were the behavior of a child under sustained pressure rather than evidence of systematic fraud across the entire case. This was a position he held to consistently. It was also, critics would note, a position that was difficult to test once it had been established, because it made the fabrication evidence compatible with continued belief in the genuine phenomena, leaving the overall claim essentially unfalsifiable from within the investigative framework. Playfair's response was similar in its structure. He acknowledged the specific fabrications. He declined to let them collapse the larger account. The investigators' stance, as both men maintained it, was one of holding a complicated mixed record, genuine events alongside manufactured ones, authentic phenomena alongside performances, and asking that they be evaluated separately rather than allowing the documented deceptions to extinguish the documented anomalies. The argument was not unreasonable on its face. Its difficulty was that the two categories were entangled in the same house, the same sessions, the same evidentiary record, and separating them required a degree of interpretive confidence that the investigative conditions could not fully support. The visiting professionals who came to 284 Green Street during the investigation brought their own lenses to the same material. A journalist from the Daily Mirror arrived early in the case. Photographers came. Rosalind Morris, a researcher associated with the SPR, spent time at the house. John Burkham, a neighbor and former police officer, became one of the regular witnesses whose testimony entered the case files. Peggy Hodgson's neighbor, Vic Nottingham, reported witnessing events in the house. A locum doctor who attended the property on an unrelated matter wrote an account of what he had seen. The investigation drew observers, the way such cases do when they become known, each one arriving with their own prior disposition toward the possible, each one adding another layer to a record that was already far from simple. There is a particular quality to an investigation that has been running for many months inside a family home. The investigators are no longer strangers. The family has accommodated itself to their presence. The children know the researchers. The researchers know the children. The household has reorganized itself, to some degree, around the sustained attention being directed at it. And that reorganization is not neutral. It affects what happens, what gets reported, what counts as significant, and how the people inside the house understand and narrate their own experience. Gross and Playfair were aware of this. Their notes occasionally reflect a tension between the warmth of sustained human proximity and the investigative distance they needed to maintain. Gross's personal circumstances made that tension more pronounced than it might otherwise have been. He was a man who had lost a daughter named Janet and was now spending long days and nights in a council house with an 11-year-old girl named Janet, who was at the center of something he found genuinely mysterious and important. He was not unaware of the parallel. He noted it. He does not appear to have concluded that it invalidated his work. The people who read the case files after the fact were sometimes less certain about that, and the question of whether Gross's grief made him a more careful investigator, more motivated to document precisely, more committed to not being fooled, or a less reliable one, more inclined toward belief, less equipped to sustain the clinical detachment that systematic observation requires, remains genuinely unanswerable. Both are possible. Both are human. The recordings Gross made during the investigation captured hundreds of hours of material inside the rooms of 284 Green Street. They captured the ambient sound of the house, the creaking of floors, the outside traffic faint through the walls, the quality of a particular room at a particular hour. They captured the Hodgson family talking among themselves, and with the investigators, they captured sessions in which reported phenomena were discussed or occasionally reported as they were occurring. The recordings were not, for the most part, recordings of anomalous events themselves. The nature of the situation meant that what the tape typically captured was the aftermath, the sound of a room after something had moved, the voices of the people who had been there describing what they had seen. Gross's incident log and Playfair's notebooks formed the spine of the documentary record. The photographs formed a supplementary layer. Still images from a case that required motion to be fully understood, frozen moments that could be analyzed for staging but could not establish what had preceded or followed them. The tape recordings formed a third layer, audio of a house in sustained disturbance, months of sound from rooms where the investigators and the family spent their time. Together, these formed the archive that would eventually be deposited with the Society for Psychical Research, where it remains accessible to researchers. What the archive contained, and what made it different from simpler cases, was not a clean body of evidence supporting one conclusion. It contained both things. It contained the specific, named, dated accounts of incidents that multiple witnesses had reported as anomalous, and that the investigators had found genuinely difficult to account for. It also contained the notes acknowledging specific fabrications, the observations that things had not always proceeded spontaneously, the record of a young girl caught in acts of performance, alongside the accounts of a young girl appearing to experience something she did not control. The archive held this complexity the way a case file holds everything that happened, without the editorial shaping that a published account applies. The folder was thicker for it. Playfair's book made choices about what to foreground and what to qualify. Every book does. The choices he made were in the direction of the case's genuine anomalies, the incidents that held up best, the witnesses who were most credible, the evidence that was hardest to explain away. The acknowledgments of fabrication were present in the text, but they were contextualized in the way an advocate contextualizes uncomfortable evidence absorbed into a larger argument without being allowed to disturb it fundamentally. This gave the book its particular character, genuinely detailed, specifically documented, and organized in a way that served the conclusion its author had arrived at before the writing began. The SPR responded to the Enfield investigation without producing an institutional verdict. This was, in a sense, the SPR functioning as intended, not as an authority that pronounced on cases, but as an organization that housed the evidence and made it available for the kind of extended, contested examination that cases of this complexity warranted. Gregory's report was part of that examination. Gross's notes were part of it. The recordings were part of it. The visiting witnesses, the photographs, the incident log, the published account, all of it entered the archive, and all of it has remained there, available to anyone who wanted to look for decades. What the SPR archive preserved was not a resolved question. It preserved a specific investigation conducted by two named people with distinct backgrounds and personal stakes in a specific house on a specific residential street in North London across a period of more than a year, during which something that remains uncharacterized happened to a family of 5. The preservation was careful. The documentation was, by the standards of its kind, unusually thorough. What it did not do, and what nothing in the record has done in the 40-odd years since, was settle the question of what was happening inside 284 Green Street in the autumn and winter of 1977 and into 1978. The archive holds the question in the same form it was in when Gross set down his notebook for the last time and left the house. The investigators themselves were changed by the case, in the way that sustained immersion in an unresolved question tends to change the people who have spent years with it. Playfair wrote about Enfield repeatedly after the book was published, returning to the case, defending its significance, engaging with critics, noting the ways in which subsequent cases or subsequent findings seemed to him to bear on what had happened at Green Street. He remained persuaded. Gross continued his work with the SPR and continued to speak about the case when asked, maintaining to the end of his life that what he had witnessed at 284 Green Street had not been explained by any framework he was willing to accept. He died in 2006. The case remained open. What neither man left behind was a document that closed the investigation. What they left was the archive, the specific, imperfect, complicated, humanly weighted body of material that the SPR held in its folders, and that researchers continued to access long after the investigation's intensive phase had ended. The incident log, the tapes, the photographs, the notes with the acknowledged fabrications alongside the accounts of things that resisted fabrication as an explanation. The two kinds of entry sitting in the same folder, in Gross's handwriting, unresolved and patient. There is something particular about a case file that contains both kinds of evidence, the genuine seeming and the demonstrably manufactured, and has not been resolved into one or the other. It does not become a case of confirmed fraud, because the record contains more than fraud can comfortably account for. It does not become a case of confirmed anomalous phenomena, because the record contains more than belief can comfortably hold. It stays in the middle distance, the folder thick and specific, the question it contains neither answered nor abandoned. The investigators who built it knew this. They built it anyway. The SPR offices in London hold the Enfield case files in the same way they hold the records of other cases that ran through the organization's long history, stored, cataloged, available. Gross's handwriting in the incident log has the particular quality of notes made quickly, in a room where things were happening, by a man who had learned early in the investigation that what he wrote down tonight might be the only record of what had occurred. The entries are specific. The dates and times are precise. The witness initials are consistently recorded. And among those entries between the accounts of reported anomalies, beside the records of long, quiet nights when nothing happened at all, are the notes where Gross set down what he had seen, when the performance was visible, when the fabrication was unmistakable, when the 11-year-old at the center of the case was caught being ordinary in the wrong direction. He did not remove those entries. He did not reconcile them in the notes with the entries that preceded and followed them. He wrote them down in the same notebook, on the same pages, in the same handwriting. The folders in the archive contain the full record as it was made, not as it would have been if the investigation had gone cleanly in one direction or the other. That is, perhaps, the most honest thing about the Enfield case files, that they were built by a man who knew what he had seen when he had seen it, who wrote it down, regardless of what it cost the argument, and who went back to the house the next day, because the question, in his judgment, had not been answered. The archive he left behind is not a verdict. It is a record of someone looking very hard at something that kept refusing to resolve. The folders sit in the SPR's collection, quiet and particular, and still in the same condition they were in when he last closed them. The question they contain remains in exactly the form he left it, open, specific, and patient. Anita Gregory's report to the Society for Psychical Research was a physical document. It had pages, it had paragraphs, It carried a named author who had visited 284 Green Street herself, had sat in the rooms where the events were reported to have occurred, had watched the children who were at the center of the case, and had written down what she saw with the attention of someone trained to observe and committed to recording observations accurately. That document exists in the SPR archive. It sits alongside the notes of the investigators who came to opposite conclusions from the same house, the same family, the same narrow hallway, on the same residential street in Brimsdown. The two accounts do not agree. Neither of them has been withdrawn. Gregory was a psychologist. Her visits to 284 Green Street were not casual. She went to the house with the deliberate intention of assessing the investigation's methodology and the credibility of the phenomena being reported, and the report she produced was formal, institutional, and specific in its criticisms. What she described was not a general impression of doubt, but a series of particular observations. She recorded witnessing Janet Hodgson and her sister Margaret engaging in deliberate staging. She documented specific acts, the manufacturing of knocking sounds by the children themselves, the attempted bending of spoons in the manner that Uri Geller had made familiar to British television audiences in those years. These were not ambiguous moments. They were, in Gregory's account, instances of children performing phenomena that were supposed to be occurring spontaneously, and they were instances she witnessed directly and wrote down. The report's criticisms extended beyond the behavior of the children to the behavior of the investigation. Gregory argued on procedural grounds that Maurice Gross and Guy Leon Playfair had failed to establish systematic controls of any kind that would allow genuine anomalous events to be distinguished from human performance. The failure, she argued, was not incidental but structural, a methodology so permissive that it could not in principle rule out fabrication, which meant it could not in principle confirm anything. The evidentiary record as a whole, she concluded, had been compromised beyond reliable use. Not this incident or that one. The whole of it. The record was not a foundation from which any finding could be drawn with confidence, because the conditions under which it was gathered could not support the weight of the conclusions placed on it. That report sat in an archive alongside the case files assembled by the investigators it criticized. Gross's notebooks were there. Playfair's incident log was there. The tape recordings were there. The written statement from the first attending police officer was there. Urkomsvanpoming, all of it occupied the same institutional space, held by the same organization, and none of it resolved the disagreement between the documents. The SPR had dispatched Gross to the house and had also received Gregory's formal criticism of everything he found there. Both things were true. The archive held them without preference. James Randi looked at the photographs of Janet Hodgson that had circulated most widely showed her apparently mid-air, her body lifted from the bed in the upstairs room, the mattress below her, no visible means of support. Randi was a professional magician. He had spent his working life understanding precisely how a moment of apparently impossible motion could be created by an ordinary body at the ordinary moment when an observer's attention or a camera's shutter happened to align with it. He knew the mechanics of performance from the inside, with the practitioner's knowledge of exactly what an untrained observer does not see and does not think to look for. When he examined the photographs, the conclusion he arrived at was direct. A child jumping from a bed at the precise instant of shutter release would produce an image indistinguishable from the images that had been presented as evidence of levitation. The distance from the bed, the position of the body, the angle of the limbs, none of it required anything beyond an 11-year-old's ordinary capacity to jump and the ordinary probability that a camera would sometimes capture the moment of ascent before the moment of return. There was no need, in his assessment, to invoke anything beyond a jump. The image did not require it. Randy's argument extended from the photographs to the broader evidentiary record. A skilled performer, he maintained, could replicate every documented phenomenon at 284 Green Street using standard conjuring techniques that untrained observers would not be equipped to detect. The witness list at Enfield was not a list of people trained to observe under performance conditions. It included a family who lived in the house and whose own perceptions were shaping what they reported. It included journalists and police officers and investigators from the Society for Psychical Research. None of them had the specialized attention of someone whose professional training involved understanding the precise mechanisms by which a skilled performer creates the impression of something that has not occurred. The gap between what those observers witnessed and what had actually happened, Randy argued, was exactly the gap that conjuring depends on. It was not a gap that goodwill or intelligence could close. It was a gap in the specific kind of attention required. The investigators themselves acknowledged this, at least partially. Within the case files, in Gross's own notes, and in Playfair's account of the investigation, there are recorded instances where Janet was directly observed throwing objects herself. She was caught at this. The observation was documented not by skeptics reviewing the record from a distance, but by the investigators who were present in the house and who had committed themselves most fully to assessing the case. The objects that had been reported to move spontaneously, to fly across rooms, to change direction mid-flight, on at least some of the occasions when those phenomena were reported, they had been produced by Janet herself, throwing them when the moment seemed right. This was not an inference drawn after the fact. It was a direct observation written down. Gross and Playfair held this information and did not conclude from it that Janet had been deceiving them throughout. Their interpretation was more particular. What they described was a child under conditions of extraordinary sustained stress, observed for months, the house full of adults with notebooks and recording equipment, sleep disrupted by disturbances, real or constructed, the ordinary rhythms of a childhood in a council house in North London, entirely displaced by an investigation that had moved into her home and showed no sign of leaving. A child in those conditions, they argued, might manufacture events when genuine activity failed to occur. The fabrication was not, in their reading, evidence that there had never been anything genuine. It was evidence of a child attempting to fulfill an expectation in the absence of the thing the expectation was built around. The two categories, genuine incident and deliberate performance, coexisted in the record, and the investigators drew a line between them, placing some events on one side and some on the other. Critics found this distinction difficult to sustain. Fabrication was acknowledged and documented. The question that followed was not how to separate the fabricated events from the genuine ones, but whether any reliable method for making that separation existed. The investigators had failed to maintain systematic controls. Gregory had made that argument, formally and specifically. If controls were absent, then the investigators' judgment about which events were genuine and which were fabricated was not a methodological finding, but a personal assessment, an impression formed under conditions that had not been designed to test it. The line Gross and Playfair drew through the record reflected their experience of the case, their closeness to the family, their sustained presence in the house. It did not reflect a procedure that an independent observer could evaluate, replicate, or verify. The line was real to the people who drew it. Whether it corresponded to anything in the events it was drawn across was a different question, and one the record could not answer. The framework of folia fami was proposed in some assessments of the Enfield case as a model that might account for the pattern of events without requiring any paranormal mechanism. The term describes a shared delusional or delusional adjacent belief system that propagates through a family unit, a process in which genuine fear or genuine misperception by one family member establishes an interpretive framework through which subsequent ordinary events are experienced and reported as paranormal. In the Enfield context, the model begins with the possibility that the initial disturbances, whatever produced them, whether a chest of drawers settling on uneven floorboards, or a sound from an adjacent property misidentified in the dark, created a framework of expectation that then organized everything that followed. Once the household was alert to the possibility that something was happening, ordinary events acquired a significance they would not otherwise have carried. A noise from downstairs was not a noise from downstairs. It was part of a pattern. The pattern, once established, reinforced itself, each member of the family's experience confirming and amplifying the others, the threshold for what qualified as an event lowering as attention sharpened. The model gains traction in the Enfield case from the observable pattern of escalation. The disturbances did not remain at a consistent level throughout the investigation. They expanded. New phenomena were reported as the investigation deepened and as media attention increased. The voice arrived weeks after the initial furniture movement. The apparent levitation was documented later still. Critics noted that the pattern of expansion matched what the folia fami model would predict, that as the investigation's expectations grew more elaborate, the events reported grew more elaborate to meet them. The family was not, in this reading, consciously deceiving anyone. They were perceiving their environment through a framework that had been established in fear and then reinforced by months of sustained investigative attention, a framework in which the ordinary and the anomalous had ceased to be reliably distinguishable from each other. This was not a comfortable model for anyone involved. It did not require deliberate deception. It required something subtler and in its way more distressing. A family in a council house in Brimsdown, isolated by their circumstances and unable to relocate, spending months inside an interpretive world that had organized itself around an initial event, whatever that event had been, and that had been amplified by every journalist and investigator and visiting professional who passed through the front door on Green Street, carrying a notebook and a prior expectation. The children in this model were not performing for an audience. They were living inside a perception of their own environment that had been altered in ways that were, by the time the investigation reached its peak, very difficult to disentangle from the environment itself. Janet Hodgson was 11 years old when the investigation began. She was still a child when it ended. The sustained attention of adults with recording equipment, the cameras, the presence of strangers in her bedroom and sitting room, the disruption of sleep, the compression of ordinary childhood into a space where the ordinary had been entirely displaced. These were not abstractions. They were conditions in which a child was living. The documented instances of fabrication, the thrown objects, the attempted spoon bending, can be held inside a psychological framework of a child manufacturing events under pressure, attempting to maintain a role that the investigation had created for her. They can also be held as evidence of something more systematic. The record does not establish which reading is correct. It contains both possibilities and leaves them open. Chris French, a British psychologist whose academic work has focused specifically on the psychology of paranormal belief, made an argument about the Enfield evidence that is worth following carefully because it addresses not any specific incident, but the structure of the evidentiary record as a whole. The argument is that volume of evidence is not a substitute for quality of evidence. A large number of observations gathered under conditions that cannot rule out human agency do not, taken together, constitute a single observation gathered under conditions that can. The mathematics of accumulation do not apply here. 100 unreliable data points do not sum to a reliable one. The size of the Enfield archive, the hours of tape, the pages of incident logs, the photographs, the witness statements, does not itself constitute evidence for the phenomena the archive documents, because the value of any given piece of evidence depends not on how much company it keeps, but on the conditions under which it was gathered. The archive is large. The conditions were not controlled. The largeness of the archive and the absence of controls are separate facts. The first does not offset the second. This is a methodological argument, and it cuts cleanly regardless of what one believes about the specific events it is applied to. A skeptic who doubts the phenomena and a researcher who finds them credible are both subject to the same logical structure. If the conditions were not controlled, the archive cannot establish what it would need to establish in order to settle the question, not because the events did not occur, and not because they did, but because the evidentiary record was gathered in a way that does not allow the question to be answered from within it. The record is what it is. The question the record was gathered to answer remains open, and the record itself, honestly assessed, cannot close it. French and others who made this argument were sometimes read as simply dismissive, as treating the accumulation of evidence as worthless because it had been gathered imperfectly, but the argument was not about worthlessness. The Enfield archive is not worthless. It is a detailed, specific, extensively documented record of what a family in a council house in North London reported experiencing over the course of more than a year, what investigators witnessed and failed to witness, what was caught on tape, and what was acknowledged as fabricated, and what remained unexplained. That is worth having. The archive is worth studying. The argument is only that studying it will not produce an answer to the central question, because the central question requires conditions the archive was not gathered under. The phenomena at 284 Green Street cannot be rerun. The house is still there. The family has long since moved on. Whatever happened in those rooms happened in 1977 and 1978, and the record of what happened was assembled by people who were not, and in the nature of the situation could not have been sufficiently detached from what they were observing to produce the quality of evidence that would allow the question to be settled. This is not a criticism of any individual. It is a description of what the situation was. The house on Green Street is still there. The address is the same. The brick facade is the same brick. The narrow hallway behind the front door is the same hallway. A little more worn, perhaps. The paintwork changed. The family who lives there now, carrying none of the specific weight that the address carried in 1977. The upstairs bedroom, where two single beds were pushed against opposite walls, is a room in an ordinary house on an ordinary residential street in the southeastern part of the London borough of Enfield. The floor is the same floor. The window that looked out onto the street below is the same window. Whatever was in that room is not there now, or if it is not making itself known. The SPR case file on the Enfield disturbances has not been closed. It is held in the archive, a physical folder containing the accumulated documentation of an investigation that ran from the autumn of 1977 through 1978, and that has never reached a conclusion that satisfies all the people who have read it. Inside the folder, There are pages that describe events for which no ordinary explanation was established. There are pages that document fabrication, acknowledged by the investigators themselves. There are pages that argue, formally and carefully, that the entire record is compromised. There are tape recordings, there are photographs, there are the handwritten notes of a man who had lost his daughter the year before and came to Brimsdown with a notebook and a personal question that the investigation, in the end, did not answer for him. All of these things exist in the same folder. They coexist without resolution. The folder has not been removed from the archive. The question inside it has not been taken out and set aside. What the Enfield case leaves behind is not a conclusion. It leaves behind a folder in an archive in London. It leaves behind audio recordings on tape that contain a voice, low and rough, produced by mechanisms a laryngologist could describe, but not explain in terms of origin or agency, still audible, still strange, still without a satisfying account. It leaves behind a council house on a residential street that still stands and still looks like every other house on the street. It leaves behind the accounts of people who were there, the children, their mother, the investigators, the police officer who filed a written statement about a chair that moved across his sitting room floor and whose statement is still in the record. It leaves behind the formal report of a psychologist who saw children manufacturing phenomena and wrote that down too. All of these things survive. The events themselves did not survive in a form that allows them to be assessed. They were specific, and they were temporary, and they occurred in conditions that were not designed for the quality of observation they required. What the investigators gathered was the best record they could produce under the circumstances they were working in. The circumstances were not ideal. They could not have been made ideal without dismantling the investigation entirely and removing the family from the house, which was not possible and was not in any case the point. The point was to understand what was happening to a specific family in a specific house, and the record that was gathered in pursuit of that understanding is the record that exists, and it is the record that remains open. There is something in that openness that does not resolve into either answer. It does not resolve into confirmation that something genuinely anomalous was present in the house on Green Street. It does not resolve into the clean conclusion that children under stress performed for investigators who were disposed to believe them and that nothing else was there. The record holds both possibilities, without preference, and what sits in the archive is not the answer to the question that was asked in 1977, but the question itself, preserved in paper and tape, and the handwriting of people who spent months inside a 2-story council house trying to determine what was real. The tape recordings made at 284 Green Street are among the most extensively circulated audio materials associated with any alleged poltergeist case in British research history. The reels were deposited with the Society for Psychical Research following the investigation and have been accessed by researchers across the decades that followed. The voice on the tapes is audible. Its acoustic characteristics, the depth, the roughness, the register produced by false vocal fold phonation are as present in the recording as they were in the room where they were captured. The tape preserves the physical fact of the sound. It does not preserve the context that would allow the sound to be assessed with confidence. It holds the voice in magnetic oxide and makes it available to anyone who listens, and what they make of it depends on what they bring to the question, and the question does not answer itself. The folder in the SPR archive holds these things together without insisting on a reading. It holds Gross's notes, and Gregory's report, and Playfair's incident log, and the transcripts of recorded sessions, and the acknowledgments of fabrication, and the accounts of events that resisted ordinary explanation, and it holds them as a collection that was assembled with imperfect tools under difficult conditions by people who were trying in their different ways to find out what was happening. They did not agree about what they found. They left behind a record that reflects their disagreement. The record is what it is. The street outside is quiet now. Green Street in Brimsdown, on any given evening in the present, is the same street it was, brick fronts running its length, small front gardens, the residential stillness of a neighborhood that has no particular historical distinction for the people who live there now and who pass number 284 without stopping. The Lea Valley corridor is still to the southeast. The light industry is still there, or some of it is. The railway infrastructure is still there. The street looks like dozens of others in the borough, and it is, and nothing about it from the outside indicates that a folder in an archive in London contains a question about what happened inside one of its houses that has never been answered. The case is old enough now that most of the people most closely involved in it are gone or no longer speak publicly about it. The events it describes belong to a specific period, a specific autumn, a specific winter, a specific family in a specific council house in North London in 1977, and the period does not come back, and the conditions do not come back, and the events cannot be re-examined under better conditions because the events are over. What remains is the record. The record sits in the archive. It does not insist on being read in any particular way. It simply persists as records do, outlasting the people who made it and the specific urgency that made it worth making, available to anyone who cares to look, and open, still open, in the way that questions are open when the circumstances required to answer them no longer exist. The folder containing the SPR's documentation of the Enfield case has not been closed. There are pages inside it that have not been looked at in years.